This is a conversation with Olivia Giaccio. She is a professional mogul skier who recently participated in the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing, China. She's also currently studying psychology at Columbia University in the city of New York. In this conversation, we discuss her love for skiing, getting into moguls, participating at the Olympics and various different World Cups, dealing with setback, dealing with injuries, and also some of her biggest inspirations. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, or rate 5 stars in Apple Podcasts. As you can see, I now have a new recording studio and one less kidney. So if you like to see this project continue, then do consider making a donation on Patreon or on Anchor. Please do consider making a contribution in any way possible so I can keep this project going. If not that, do consider sharing these episodes on social media platforms of your choice, on YouTube or Instagram or Twitter. Like and comment, and I'll give you as much love as I can when I meet you in person. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And now, welcome people. It's no time. For my first question, I would like to start off with 2 quotes. The first is by this inspirational woman named Oprah Winfrey, who once said that skiing is the next best thing to having wings. The second quote that I have is from this highly inspirational woman named Olivia Giaccio. I think you've met. Who once said that the thrill associated with stepping through the gate and knowing that I'm just about to have the run of my life is a feeling that I'm going to cherish years after I'm done with mogul skiing. So based on these 2 quotes, for my first question, I would like you to paint a scene. Just picture that you've walked through a gate and you're standing on top of your mark, you're looking down on the slope, and you're just about to execute a run. What are the thoughts that are going through your mind? Are you nervous? Are you excited? Are you scared? Or I might be stretching this slightly, but do you ever get the feeling like Oprah that you're just about to fly?
I would probably say all of the above. I think skiing, it's so easy to get lost in, which is, like what Oprah said, the next best thing to having wings. But I think that when I step into the gate, there's so many different emotions, and competing, I think, is all about kind of focusing and being able to harness those emotions and get in the zone in a way that works best for you. And for me, that's kind of just calming down and feeling like I'm poised and ready to compete, and thinking about both my technical and tactical keywords and then going. I would say I'm usually, I've been nervous in the past. I would say now it definitely depends on the event a little bit that I'm competing in, but I think more excitement would be a good word to describe it.
Interesting. It depends on the event. Now that you've taken part in the Olympics, I'm assuming all the normal runs are now it's all easy for you. Because you've done the big one, right?
Well, it's interesting because the field at the Olympics is actually smaller, and it's not the depth isn't as there's not as much depth to the field at the Olympics compared to other events that we ski in throughout the year.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the previous interview as well, I think that when you took part in the Olympics, because of COVID, there were less people there, families were not allowed, whereas at a World Cup, you would often have a lot more people. So for some reason, the World Cup felt a lot bigger, and there was a lot more pressure in that sense, where the Olympics, you were just allowed to
some extent. I mean, I think internally I would say overall it was like a really good introduction to the Olympics, because there wasn't as much distraction, I would say, in certain elements. I mean, there was distraction when it came to COVID, but otherwise, in terms of having a ton of friends there that aren't normally at events, or people that I want to, I guess, spend time with, but also celebrate the moment with, that all wasn't there, and that was kind of saved for after the event. So I would say World Cups all throughout last season, the audience or spectators were pretty sparse, with the exception of probably the US World Cup. But so we were kind of used to it going into the games, but in that sense, it did take away a little bit of the pressure, and it was more about how I wanted my personal process to go, which was fun.
This started with the question of what you feel when you look down and just before a run, and you mentioned it's a mixture of feelings. Of course, you're quite excited these days. How does that contrast with the moment at the Olympics or at the World Cup itself? Were you excited, or were the nerves just taking over? The few videos that I've watched of you competing, it seems like you've taken a moment to just take a breath, calm yourself, and you also speak to yourself a bit. So, what exactly are you feeling in those moments at the tournaments in particular? And what do you say to yourself?
I say to myself usually my performance statement, which is I'm resilient and a great competitor. Attack, and then usually I'll have just like one or two keywords, which kind of focuses my attention on what I'm going to do in the run. So that'll be literally just one word or two words on the only thing, like the biggest thing that I'm going to focus on in that run. And then just when I think before I start my competition run, those moments before I think are really important. And I think that in the past, I've kind of like gotten in the habit of getting a little bit stiff right out of the gate, like in the years probably prior to the past two, like 2019, I would say, and before. I would be like a little bit stiff in the gate and then not have that feeling of being in the zone and being able to immediately start fluidly skiing my run. So I think that those like composure breaths are a really good way for me to kind of zero in on what I want to do and get my heart rate lower before I go.
Very interesting to know what goes through your mind at an event like the Olympics. I'm nowhere close to being an Olympian myself. I read once that there was a sport called poodle clipping. So who could clip the most amount of poodles, the dogs, within 2 hours. I'm sure if that was a sport,
that's a good sport. Yeah.
Even if it was a sport today, I still wouldn't make it in the Olympics. So it's very nice to know like what goes through your mind. This is the closest I'll get to it. As you speak about skiing, we've spoken a lot about the kind of emotions you go through, how you prepare for it. Do you feel that skiing represents something much bigger for you than just a few jumps, a few tricks, a few runs? And I say this partly because what you've achieved in the sport is monumental. You're one of the youngest to do this. You're the first woman in history to land a Cork 1080 as well. Clearly, there's a desire within you to push the sport even further, leave it in a much better place than you found it, leave some form of legacy behind. How do you view skiing? Do you think it's just a tool or a medium for you to, or a tool or medium that represents something bigger, or that leaves some form of a legacy behind? Or do you feel you're purely driven by just the love for skiing?
Oh, there's so many things within that question. So one thing I will say about the Olympics in particular is that when I was at the top of that run, I think it would be easy to kind of like drop into the more spiraling feelings of how badly I want a really good result at that event and how much I'd like, not desperately, but really want to perform because it is the Olympics. And there are so many more eyes on me, I know, watching from afar, and how monumental that event is within our sport in particular. And then I would say, rather than that, one thing I really kind of felt, especially before my first qualifications run, was just how thankful I was to be there and how much, I guess, work it had taken for me to get to that moment, and how much gratitude I felt, I guess, like for the whole process. And no matter what had happened at that event, that I would feel like really just thankful that I had made it there, and to have that, I guess, as like a part of my career and part of my story. And then in terms of the legacy question you asked, I would say it's a little bit of both. Like, I absolutely adore skiing, and I love mogul skiing in particular because of the three different aspects to it. Like, I have to be well-rounded in all three aspects of the sport. So in terms of ski technique, jump technique, and then speed, all three of those have to be at the top of my game. I can't be good at just one, which I think is always like a challenging aspect of the sport, but something I love about it, just because there's always this constant desire for improvement, that I think also kind of fits my character and like personality a little bit too. And then I always did want to leave a legacy behind in mogul skiing, in the sense that it would like, in the sense that women could do just as big of jumps and just as difficult of jumps as men can do. And I think that the women's side of sport had kind of stagnated for a little while in respect to jumping. I think turns progressed substantially, but just in respect to jumping, there was kind of this stereotype. Oops.
Don't destroy my set. This is not the moment. -5 points.
There's this stereotype in which like women couldn't jump as well as men, and I think that over the years when I would be jumping well, let's say during training with my teammates, there were like I have been told by guys on the team that I'm jumping as well as a guy, which I take to be a compliment, or that I'm crazy, or that I don't know, that it's kind of absurd that I'm jumping this way. But I think there are more girls now who kind of realize that that door has opened at this point, and then also that it is like very, very possible, because it's not a risk. It's not an impossible risk for women on the World Cup Tour circuit or the NORAM, the step below that circuit for girls to take, I would say. Like it's a very feasible thing to do. And I think that over the next couple of years, especially with Cork 10s, there are going to be a number of other girls. And I know there are 3 other girls on my team who have done that trick on snow too, which is pretty exciting. And they're all like at least 4 years younger than I am. And some of them have skied on World Cup consistently. And so I think it'll be sweet to see what the girls who are on World Cup now, as well as the up-and-comers, what's going to happen next with all of that. But I'm excited and really kind of honored that I paved the way a little bit. That was a really, really big accomplishment for me. And it was cool to accomplish it also during a time in which there was a lot of stress during Olympic qualifications, I would say. And there's so much uncertainty with that process. And I mean, I was better prepared to go through that in this past year than I was in 2018. But still, it was nice to focus on something that was bigger than me and something that I wanted to, I guess, like push the boundaries for on the women's side of sport in general.
I do get the feeling that you are pushing the sport and leaving it in a much better place than where you found it. And it's only been like 5 or 6 years since you've been competing professionally, and I'm sure there's a lot more to come. I want to also talk about your journey. So you grew up in Redding, Connecticut. You've been around the States, of course. You're from Mount Kisco. You've currently stayed in Park City, Utah. You've been around Colorado, Killington, Vermont, of course. But I believe Redding is where you spent a large chunk of your childhood. So if I were to visit Redding tomorrow, or the region around it, what are the few places that you think I have to visit? And it could be a landmark, it could be a place to visit, it could be a restaurant or some food that you feel is unique to Redding. What do you think I should do?
Well, I haven't been there in like 6 or 7 years.
From your childhood, whatever you remember.
From my childhood, there was this really good Italian restaurant that's no longer there.
Oh.
Yeah, that was by the train tracks that were like 5 minutes from my house. I would say at this point, though, in my life, I've probably spent the most time in Park City and then Steamboat Springs, Colorado. But yeah, I could give you recommendations for those.
Yeah, I would love to hear recommendations of Park City.
Park City. There's so many fun things to do. I love mountain biking there. I think that's a must. There's so many good trails too on all of the ski resorts there. So Canyons, Park City, Deer Valley all have mountain bike trails, as well as Round Valley, which is kind of in between all 3. And then but like a tiny bit further north, I believe. And then there are really good trails in Salt Lake as well. That's really fun. The sunsets there are gorgeous. If you go up Guardsman's Pass, which is kind of to the top of Park City and Deer Valley, a little bit in between the two. There's gorgeous mountain views. There's so many good hikes as well, lakes to go swimming in. Yeah, I mean, that amount of outdoor activities out there is endless. And then I would say in terms of restaurants, what would be my favorite?
How about what is your go-to cheat meal? And it could be in Park City, it could be in New York City as well.
Go-to cheat meal. I mean, New York City, a 99-cent slice, you're never going to go wrong.
Yeah, safe answer.
Yeah. I would say in Park City, though, there's like a burrito or Mexican food place called Alberto's that has really good burritos.
I have to try Alberto's then. Park City, Utah, and also all the trails, the hiking trails and the cycling trails that you mentioned. When you were, I think when you were the age of 10, your mother signed you up for Mogul skiing courses. And at that point, it felt like a random decision. You could have easily gotten into alpine skiing, Nordic skiing, snowboarding, or not into skiing at all. There's a strong possibility. So do you ever sit back and reflect on that one decision that your mother made and the butterfly effect of that? Or do you get the feeling that if she had not signed you up for mogul skiing, you might have still ended up making your way into mogul skiing somehow, or you might have never made it?
I think it's possible that I probably never would have heard about mogul skiing or ended up there. I mean, skiing at Killington, there is a very strong culture of mogul skiing. They have like this public event every year that in the springtime that anyone can enter in. And so that was always something that I did when I was really young. But I believe by that point I had already joined the mogul team. But it's kind of a widespread, I would say, like practice, I guess, in Killington as well. So maybe in a roundabout way I would have figured it out. But I mean, I had also for one point like snowboarded on Saturdays, I think, and then skied on Sundays. And then I had tried to move up in the snowboarding groups, and I rode with that group for a day, and the instructor told me that I wasn't good enough. So I switched to moguls for 2 days on the weekends, which I guess that's kind of another decision that I wonder if I would have ended up in snowboarding. But yeah, I'm happy about the path that I've been on, I guess. It's definitely a unique one. But I think regardless, I would have been involved in sport. Yeah.
Or skiing of some form. I mean, your last name, Giaccio, in Italian, I think it translates to ice.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's some destiny. There's some
I
destiny.
guess.
I guess.
If you believe in destiny.
But clearly, I mean, if your name just translates to ice and you're into skiing, come on, there is a possibility.
I guess, maybe, yeah. And the next Olympics are in Italy too.
Oh, really? Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. So you got into mogul skiing at the age of 10, and then your first World Cup was in Tazawako, Japan.
My first World Cup was actually in Deer Valley,
right,
Utah in, I believe that would have been 2016 when I was 15 years old.
Your first podium finish.
Podium was in
Tazawako, Japan. And in a previous interview, you mentioned that once you won that World Cup, a lot of people came up to you saying, congratulations, that's a huge achievement. And you're still so young, in a tone that suggested that, wow, that's so cute for someone your age. And you were speaking previously as well about people saying how you're executing jumps that the men are doing as well, also can be quite annoying. What I want to check with you is, of course, 5 years have passed since your first podium finish. You've had a lot more victories. Of course, you've seen a lot of growth. You've had a lot of injuries as well, a lot of setbacks, a few disappointments. How do you view your first World Cup victory now? When you look back, do you get the feeling that you were quite young, or do you feel like you have grown so much that you're not able to relate to the Olivia that participated in Japan?
I think I'm definitely able to relate to that past Olivia. But I mean, one thing that has always kind of not gotten on my nerves, but not annoyed me a little bit was just that when people do say that I'm quite young, it irks me in a sense just because it's not really something that I earned. Like, I didn't earn my age, and that's something that can also be like, if it's an achievement or an accomplishment, that's something that can be taken away when someone is younger than me and accomplishes the same thing just earlier. And so I think that like the doing something first, such as the 1080, that gave me a lot more pride in the end. But I would say just me now in relation to that past Olivia, I think that whole day I remember that day pretty well, but I was a deer in the headlights the whole time. I would say I didn't really know what was going on, not because of my age, but because of my lack of experience on World Cup. I think I was probably just about at 10 starts then. And now I have no idea what I'm at, maybe 30s or 40s, probably 30s. But yeah, I would say like I've entered a lot more events, had a lot more experience at this point. Had a lot more experience at this point. And yeah, I think it was just all kind of part of my journey though. One thing that was pretty frustrating though, I will say, is having that podium in 2017 and then having, what was it, a 4.5 year drought until my next one, which was interesting because I was progressing technically, and towards the end of that 4 years I progressed a ton mentally, and that's kind of why that victory came to be when it did, back last year in December of 2021. But not having a podium for 4 years was definitely a very frustrating thing to think about when it came to my career as a whole.
Are you susceptible to the thoughts like, oh, that was a fluke because it's been so many years since that happened?
I would say in the past, yes. But I would say, like, when I injured my knee at the very end of 2019 and did my ACL recovery throughout most of 2020, that was really more a mental recovery than it was a physical recovery for me. And so I think that kind of building that mental toughness, I don't really know if I kind of think that way anymore now, because I think not having those results over those 4 years kind of gave me that motivation to build back up. And in some ways I did not start from scratch, but when I did come back from my knee, I came through like a lower level and then won a bit there before I was able to really make those results happen on World Cup, which was awesome. And now I feel, I would say, probably more confident in my abilities, definitely more confident in my abilities and my ability to perform, especially.
You mentioned the ACL injury allowed you to recover mentally more than physically. I do want to check one more aspect of the injury. When you tore your ACL, you had to spend close to a year off the sport. And in a previous interview, you mentioned that this injury allowed you to really find a lot more balance in life, in your words, where you felt that in the past, your identity was coupled with being an athlete and just coupled around sports. And you felt that this injury allowed you to find new pursuits, get new hobbies, go on road trips, find new friends, of course, and anchor your life on many different aspects instead of just sports. Where do you stand on this? I find this to be a very interesting debate. You have so many real life examples of athletes who are obsessed with their sport, who are only focused on the sport and they know nothing else, and that's what they speak about. And now you've experienced balancing your life and, of course, anchoring around different things. What do you think works better for you? Do you think having a more measured, well-rounded approach works better for you? You've seen the performance on the slope itself, or do you feel like being obsessed with the sport would be better for you?
I think it depends on the individual, but for me, I would say a more well-rounded approach works better. And one thing I will say though, when I approach anything, whether it be skiing school or I guess kind of like the activities I do beyond those two realms of my life, I definitely go all in and I become obsessed with it in a sense to where I'm always looking to pursue the one thing that I can do to improve myself and I guess my competency in that area. But I think that there is a lot to be said to just being obsessed with that sport. But I think, and at least for me, it kind of, once that ACL injury did happen and I was at home for an extended period of time, which I hadn't been in years, it was a kind of like a what now and who am I without skiing? And so I think in that sense, it kind of gives me more of a real life. Not a real life, that's a bad way of saying it, but more of a, I guess a balanced life and things that make me happy outside of sport. Because after my sport is done and after my time in mogul skiing is done and after I retire, I am going to lead a life without being so competitively and obsessively, I guess, involved in mogul skiing. And I think figuring that out, like I guess preliminarily, was really, really helpful for me. And I think it kind of increased just my overall happiness as a whole. Yeah.
Well, that's great to hear. And tying this in with you're currently studying at Columbia University and you're leaning towards psychology. I believe that's going to be your major. Do you think there are any benefits of studying psychology that you can apply in skiing? Or do you think we have to really stretch our imagination to find any kind of a link between the two?
No, I took this social psychology class last summer actually online, and that was the class that convinced me that I wanted to study psychology in greater depth. And there were just so many connections to not only skiing but my everyday life. Not only skiing but my everyday life that were just so, I guess, profound to me, and it helped me kind of navigate my, I would say, relationships, and that's anywhere from like familial to relationships with my peers or relationships with my coaches too. I think that helped, and then it also gave me a little bit of a deeper understanding on how other people perceive me and how my behavior alters theirs, and also alters their perception of me. But yeah, I would say there's absolutely a correlation. And then also with school and skiing, I've always really enjoyed balancing it. And I had, during my junior and senior years of high school, I went to an online high school where I had to attend like synchronous Zoom sessions essentially. And so I learned how to balance school and skiing then. And I also found that doing both at the same time in a full-time way gave me more motivation for each aspect of my life, I would say. And so that's something that I definitely enjoy doing today too, wherever possible. Like during the academic year of 2020, 2021, I did my freshman year at Columbia all online, and I really enjoyed it. And I loved pairing that with my time on World Cup as well.
There is a correlation between psychology and skiing. I would have never thought so.
I know.
Anyone who wants to be a skier in the future, take up psychology. I guess that is the trajectory you need to follow. Before we start wrapping up, I also want to check with you. In a previous interview, you mentioned that there's an interesting dynamic with mogul skiing or qualifying for the Olympics, where I think there's a fixed number of spots and that can be split across many different forms of skiing. So it would not be necessary that if you're good at mogul skiing, moguls just the top 4 might go. You might be competing with people from other sports as well.
Mm-hmm.
How do you view this dynamic? I find this to be slightly jarring to think of, because typically you qualify for the sport that you compete in. If you're good, you end up making it. But in this case, a lot of it might depend on luck as well, and you're also watching other different sports and how they perform. How do you come to terms with this? How do you deal with this? And what is your view of this particular system that exists?
It's pretty interesting. I would say it doesn't tend to affect our current women's team as much as it does our men's team, just because so essentially it's just, I believe it's 36 spots across probably 6 different disciplines, I would say. That's probably about right. And so each gender can get, of one sport or one discipline, can get up to 4 people who can go to the Olympics. And if your team is quite good, then you'll likely fill all 4 spots. But if you are more, I would say, in the mix of probably top 10, top 20 for your sport, then it's you are more in the running relative to other sports as well. And so I think it's definitely a really interesting process on so many levels, and just qualifying within your team based on, my teammates are people who during the winters I spend hands down the most time with, but they're also my number one competitors for those spots, which is definitely an interesting dynamic to navigate, and then something that people don't necessarily realize as well. So it's not the top 30 in the world in your sport that go, it's just within each nation. And then some nations decide not to bring as many people because they'd like to allocate it to other sports which have more medal potential. So for example, like this past Olympics, like Canada didn't fill all of their spots for mogul skiing, even though they have decent skiers. And so it's just a kind of an interesting dynamic all around to see how all of that plays out. And at the end of the day, though, you just focus on your process and how to best execute what you're there to do.
Very interesting dynamic.
Yeah,
it was a slightly confusing one for me, because
it is confusing.
Typically you would just qualify for the sport if you're good enough for it. So, but yeah, interesting that you shared that. Before we move to our final questions, I would love for you to interpret what we have built with the Lego. I think so what do you think you've built?
Well, they're the dark columns. They are Doric columns.
Is this meant to represent Law Library from Columbia?
Well, that's what I had asked you.
Sorry, I asked the questions. It's just
It doesn't
if you
go
have to
both
ask questions, it's on your show. What do you think I've built? This is going to be tougher.
This is tougher.
Yeah.
And even no. Is it meant to stand this way?
Oh, it could be anything you like it to be.
I don't know.
What's your wildest guess?
My wildest guess. Did you build something? Was it meant to have something to do with skiing? Or no? No.
Of course, everything's planned. No. I was just building something, but does this stand out as a shape of anything in particular?
I feel like I should know this.
No, I wasn't planning to build something. It's not a shape.
No.
It's just random parts together.
No. Could be the start of an aircraft.
Start of an aircraft is exactly what I was going for. Perfect. That is 50 points.
Nice. Finally in the positive.
Finally in the positive. Okay, so let's start wrapping up with some final questions. What are some books, movies, TV shows that have strongly influenced in your life?
Books, movies, TV shows. My favorite movie is Shawshank Redemption. My favorite book would probably be Conversations with Friends. I finished that one so quickly. I also really enjoyed Evicted. That was a good kind of ethnography on the housing crisis in the US. And then I'm trying to think if there are any like sports books. The Champion's Mind, I thought, was a good sports psych book. Yeah, and then TV shows. I'm not a huge TV watcher, honestly. I mean, the last, I think, full series I watched was probably The Office, and that took me 3 years to finish.
That's a feat. I never finished it. So
I
watched the British one because it only had 10 episodes. So
oh, nice.
Just get through it.
Called it done.
Yeah, it's done. I watched The Office. Yeah, that's it. Interesting. I'm looking forward to reading all those books that you mentioned. You've cited Hannah Kearney, Heather McPhie as two major inspirations for you. What qualities about them stand out to you? Why do you look up to them?
I mean, I think with Hannah, she was just so relentlessly dominant in mogul skiing and was really, I would say, wanted to win and had a fantastic process, I think, from the few times that I've kind of seen her and her work ethic. And then Heather, I think, was a huge inspiration for me in that she was able to push the boundaries of women's sport, and she was one of the first to do backfull and cork 7 in the same run, or D-spin in the same run, and still get really good results with it. And I think that those two things combined definitely push the women's side of sport because it focuses kind of that, or it forces that trickle down effect to other skiers on World Cup as well as at the lower levels. So yeah, and it was awesome to have kind of those two skiers be US skiers as I was growing up in the sport.
Yeah, great inspiration to have. Who do you think are some of the greatest athletes in history? And feel free to go beyond skiing as well for this question.
I mean, in mogul skiing, Mikkel Kingsbury, absolutely. He's so dominant. It's crazy. And it's really cool to ski on World Cup with him at the same time, just because you kind of can get like an in-depth look on how he operates and how tactical he is. And I think that's something I've tried to apply into my own process and how I compete as well. And so it's always interesting to watch him during events. Beyond sport, I'm a huge fan of the whole U.S. women's soccer team, like Megan Rapinoe, Abby Wambach, who used to play, and then Alex Morgan. And then I would say I also adored watching gymnastics at like when I was first exposed to the Olympics. So like Gabby Douglas, and then more recently Simone Biles.
That's an interesting list. I was a huge fan of the US women's soccer team as well, Megan Rapinoe as well, when they were taking part in the World Cup a few years ago.
Yeah.
Final 2 questions for you. I think we already covered a part of it, but what would you like your legacy to be like? How would you like to be remembered in skiing and beyond?
In skiing and beyond. I think first and foremost, I want to be viewed as, I would say, as a good, kind human being. I think that is kind of something that's essential to who I am and who I hope to be as a person above everything else, I would say. And then also to be within skiing, pushing the women's side of sport, as well as being having, I would say, like being very fierce and competitive and confident in the way I perform and handle myself. And then, I think that probably covers it.
It does. I think you've already built a strong legacy and there's a lot more to come. Final question for you. Seth Godin had once said that life is like skiing. Just like skiing, the goal is not to get to the bottom of the hill, but to have a bunch of few good runs before the sun sets. So my final question for you is, what do you think is the meaning of life?
What do I think is? I think enjoying the present moment. That would probably be how I would interpret it. Is there any meaning?
I'll answer that on your show, but enjoying the present moment is always a good meaning to have and a great way to live life. Olivia, thank you so much. If people want to connect with you, find out what you're up to next, where can they do so?
My Instagram is Olivia Giaccio, and then you can also find more about me on my website, and my blog is also there at www.oliviagiaccio.com.
Olivia,
thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation.